This morning, if you would grab your take-home work, so that way you can go deeper this week, is found in your bulletin. Put it in your pocket or purse, and that way throughout the week you can continue to study deeper this topic that we're talking about. Life isn't fair. To give you an idea of what's coming up in the next few weeks, next week is our last Sunday focused on Ecclesiastes, and the last lesson that we have from the Wise One. And after that, we have Ash Wednesday, which will be held in the chapel on Wednesday of that week. And then we kick off a new sermon series for the season of Lent called The 7 Last Words from the Cross. And we're going to explore the 7 last words that Jesus spoke from the cross. They're actually phrases. And so we'll do that on 6 Sundays, and then on Good Friday we'll look at the final word from the cross together. Of all the sermon series I've done in my years of preaching, this for me is the best sermon series I've ever been a part of. To think about what are the words that Jesus uses as he's dying, those are some powerful words for us to hear. And perhaps that should shape us as a people. And so I look forward to exploring those scriptures with you throughout Lent. And then obviously on Easter, we're going to have an amazing celebration. 6 o'clock in the morning at Punch Bowl National Cemetery, I'm going to be preaching and our youth choir is going to be singing. So if you want to come before sunrise and watch the sun come up as we celebrate the resurrection, we invite you there, and then we have 7 o'clock in the chapel, 9 o'clock in here, and 11 o'clock in the parish hall. So be sure to invite someone on this most joyous day of our year. And so would you join me as we begin our sermon time together? There are times in our lives, God, where the only phrase that we feel that we can speak and utter are the words, "It's not fair." Because, God, there's injustice in our world. Sometimes we are the recipients of that injustice, and quite honestly, there are times when we knowingly or unknowingly perpetuate it. On this day, as we look at this book of Ecclesiastes, may the wisdom of this writer come through. May your Spirit grant us ears that might hear, hearts that are willing to receive, and the courage to actually follow through, to be your disciples today and all the days ahead. For it's the name of Jesus our Christ that we pray. Amen. There's an old comic, Calvin and Hobbes, that I've always enjoyed reading. And there's one that really strikes a chord. It's a picture of in which Calvin is speaking to his father and says, "Why can't I stay up late? You guys get to." And then he screams out, "It's not fair!" And Calvin's dad looks at him and simply says, "The world isn't fair, Calvin." To which Calvin responds, "I know, but why isn't it ever unfair in my favor?" You see, there's times in our lives where we understand this idea of fairness and unfairness. And in our world throughout history, this has been seen in major ways as well as individual ways. But today I thought, what an appropriate Sunday not only to celebrate the ministry of our community, but also the reality of what has happened in our past in the state of Hawaii, and even before that in the Kingdom of Hawaii. And so I asked Dr. Kalani Brady to come out. And as many of you know, he sings here as one of our soloists and does a fine job with that, but he's also a medical doctor. And part of his practice is going over to Molokai to the, you say the word.
Kalaupapa.
Kalaupapa. I'm trying to say it correctly, and I'm working on that still, but as part of his ministry to the world, and specifically with his skills in being a doctor. And as we think about life being unfair, perhaps no other community around this area comes up more frequently than this community of lepers. And so we have a few questions that we're going to go back and forth with. And many of you may already know the history of this. For those of you that are visiting from Texas, which is the number one space today, wherever, I don't know what's happening in Texas this week, but welcome to Hawaii. But many of you are going to learn something new today, and it's about a community on a neighboring island. And what I would like for you to do is share the history of this community and what has happened there.
A little background. Between 300,000 and 800,000 Native Hawaiians lived here in tight rules and regulations called kapu at the time that Captain James Cook rediscovered the islands for Western civilization. Within a few decades, merchant seamen, whalers, missionaries, and others came to Hawaii, bringing with them, unintentionally, diseases that the Western continent had already experienced, but that to which the Hawaiians were naive immunologically. So between 1778 and the mid-18th century, mid-1800s, almost 90% of the entire population of the Kingdom of Hawaii died. Only 10% were left. And they died of measles and smallpox, of the plague, of typhoid, and these epidemics would come through and kill thousands to 10,000 10,000s of Hawaiians at the same time. And then in the 1850s, an epidemic of a different type occurred. You see, in those epidemics, someone caught the disease, and if they were going to die within a couple of days after suffering, they would die and go to their blessed rest. Mm-hmm. But there was another disease, Hansen's disease now called, or leprosy in those days, where the devil mauled the features of the human being that caught leprosy, and they lived a life of 15 to 20 years, feared and repudiated by everyone around them. So in the 1860s, people who were suspected of having leprosy were arrested. You see, there were no quarantine laws, so they borrowed the penal code, but in so doing, they dehumanized the Hansen's patients, and they were arrested. They went to trial, and if convicted by a group of Western doctors, they were sentenced to life imprisonment in Kalaupapa. And so they were separated for life to a future of suffering and despair and abandonment by the family to eventually die of their wounds in Kalaupapa.
Mm. And at the first service, I had a couple come out to me afterwards who shared that his uncle and her cousin were people that were sent there back in the time, and that not only were they stripped of their family, but they were stripped of every right, including land and anything else. So they were basically treated as a different kind of people and isolated on purpose. What kind of impact would that have on a community and on people specifically that were seen as criminals in the system that were then taken far away from home and separated forevermore from their families and their livelihoods?
Right. So in Hawaii, as in many other cultures, family is so crucial. Mm-hmm. Family is important. And occasionally, a family member would sacrifice their entire life to go to Kalaupapa and care for their sick relative. But most of the time, the families would cut that relationship and would fade away into the distance, leaving the poor leper or Hansen's patient without any support. And they would go to this land and look to their future and see the horrific-looking people around them, and they knew that they too would be dehumanized and considered a leper. They would have stench from the wounds that gaped until one of the wounds got serious enough that they would die years or perhaps a decade later.
Wow. Well, so you've been working with this community specifically for how long?
I've been there 10 and a half years.
I love that he uses half still. It's like my kids when they ask, how old are you? And they say 7 and a half. 10 and a half years. Good job.
10 and a half years.
And what I see this as a ministry that you get to do. What drew you to this ministry of being a doctor there?
When I was 11, I was hanai'd by the Aluli Farden family in Kailua, where we lived. Mm-hmm. And Emmett Aluli was one of the rising stars in that family. And he and I are active in the Native Hawaiian Physicians Organization. Well, he called me up 11 years ago and said, "Kalani, We need Hawaiians caring for Hawaiians in Kalaupapa, because you see, there are cultural sensitivities and trust that Hawaiians have uniquely, unfortunately, given history for Hawaiians. Sure. So I put together a hui, a group of Hawaiians, including Dr. Peter Donnelly, a Kamehameha grad, and Dr. Martina Kamaka, also a Kamehameha grad, and myself, and we would go down into Kalaupapa to take care of, at that time, the 50 Hansen's patients that were still left. I used to go twice a week, and it was a vibrant community. I would rehearse the choir. I'd leave Central Union after our 9 o'clock service, and I'd go to the airport, and I'd catch the noon flight to Kalaupapa, and then Sunday afternoon, we'd have choir. And we'd get ready for the next Sunday morning when I would be absent, but at least we had a choir director in absentia. And Central Union Church donated pilgrim hymnals, actually, to Kana'anaho, the New Canaan church, which is our UCC church in Kalaupapa.
That's great. Well, and one of the other questions that we have been talking about, and specifically this Sunday dealing with, is the statement, life isn't fair. What do you think about when you hear that phrase in Kalaupapa?
Well, if you can imagine yourself being a person trying to be just and righteous and catching this disease for no apparent reason, and then being arrested, convicted, and sentenced to life, how much worse can it be? And how much more poignant that phrase, "it's not fair," would be for those people. To lose your family. And you know, those patients, the average age of onset early on was in the teens. And those patients would be sentenced to Kalaupapa in their teen years and know no other place, be able to go nowhere else on earth but Kalaupapa. And they would grow through adolescence and fall in love like others do, and they would marry like others do, and then they would have children. And at that time, we didn't know how Hansen's disease was transmitted. So a mother pregnant with child would deliver, look at her own child through glass for the day or so until the next steamer went to Honolulu, at which time she would never see that child again. Child after child after child was lost. And when they got to Honolulu, the Department of Health forged the birth certificates, because who would adopt a child that might be a leper that was born in Kalaupapa? So instead of the birth certificate saying born in Kalaupapa, it said born in Honolulu. And there was therefore no way that a mother later on could trace her own children, her own sons and daughters. She had lost her family from around her in her generation, and then she lost all family from the subsequent generation. It's not fair.
Yeah. And one of the things as we were discussing this morning, I'm always struck by this image of Jesus walking along doing ministry, and leprosy was a widely known problem in the ancient world as well. And the difference was that the code of ethics, if you will, for the Israelite people was they had to stay away, and the lepers had to scream as loud as they could, "Unclean, unclean, unclean," so that no one would touch them. And through that experience, Jesus would walk up and lay a hand on them and speak to them a word. Certainly our scriptures portrayed as a physical healing manifested in their being well. But also it sounds like the societal part of it is equally as important of the healing, is that being stripped of your right of being human, Jesus gives humanity back to them and a place back in their families and in society at large.
True. As a matter of fact, as many of you know, there was a Catholic Christian named Damien de Verster, Joseph born, but took the name as he became a priest as Damien, and he went sacrificing his own life to Kalaupapa, and therefore he was sentenced because anyone who went to Kalaupapa stayed there, and he was largely confined to Kalaupapa, and he in fact caught the disease. So he entered this community of people without hope, of people so angry and bitter at God and the injustice of their lives that they spent a life of sin, of drunkenness, of orgies, of things that were horrific because they had no love for God or each other. And he came and he didn't cure them like Jesus did, but perhaps another miracle which was just as potent. He accepted from God leprosy himself. And he did not lose his faith. He did not lose his piety. He did not lose his love for individuals who were in Kalaupapa, not lepers, but individual people who had been stricken by this disease. And in so providing an example for the community of Kalaupapa, a lot of what happened with the sins of Kalaupapa was reversed. And he created a community with hope and trust in God again and worship. And so Damien actually brought this about by considering lepers not as lepers, not dehumanizing them, but as Jesus did, by using a name, by recognizing their humanity, and by showing himself as the example.
That's great. And that's a great segue into the rest of our sermon. So will you thank Kalani for sharing his story and the story of Kalaupapa with us today? You see, just in this last century alone, we can look at cases after cases. We think of the Holocaust. We think of Rwanda and the genocide. We think of Kalaupapa, of injustices that have happened to groups of people. In the 80s, many of you will remember that HIV/AIDS became of age and suddenly started spreading. And people were worried that if you got near someone with HIV/AIDS, you would contract it like you would the average cold. And so suddenly they started becoming treated differently. But the thing that I've wrestled with this week is I listened and read stories about Kalaupapa and the history of what humanity has done to each other, is the struggle that I can't think of a single person that I know that hasn't said at some time in their lives, life isn't fair. Can you think of a single person that hasn't used that phrase about something? What about yourself? You see, we oftentimes use this phrase and we can look to these major examples as injustice and how life really isn't fair. But if truth be told, if you looked inside the mirror at yourself, you've used that phrase too. I have. Life isn't fair because of something going on in my life. It may be because of many different situations, but what I have come to realize is that when we use that phrase, what we really are saying is that we feel like we've been wronged, taken advantage of, looked over, or simply ignored. We've been wronged, taken advantage of, looked over, or ignored. In essence, what we are saying is that our basic human rights have been diminished or dismissed, and we want justice, rightness, wholeness. I've heard people complain that they have not enough, and why is it that we live in a world with plenty and I don't have enough? I've heard of people that have plenty that complain that those others want to take my stuff that I earned. I've heard of children complain that they don't get enough sugar in their diet. And I've heard parents complain that they don't get enough vegetables and fruit. You see, the reality under heaven that we experience is injustice. And injustice for me has become something that I've wrestled with because it's all around us. It always has been, and seemingly it always will be. And so how do we deal with the injustices of this world when life isn't fair? Back in seminary, I took a class with Brent, who convinced me to take this class. He was here last week. And it was The Problem of Evil was the title, philosophy. And so I took it because I made him take a class with me. And so I sat on the first day, and on the last day, I learned absolutely nothing other than a circular argument. But I had to write a paper, and on this paper I wrote about the problem of evil in our world, in me, in you, in nature. And I said, take, for example, natural evil, that thing that happens in our world all around us. Things like hurricanes, tsunamis, floods, tornadoes, blizzards, things of those nature. And we see them as evil because we're in the path of them. But I used to live in Florida. You're living in a peninsula in the middle of an ocean. And what ended up happening was that we got hit by hurricanes, and what we learned was that hurricanes are actually really, really good for the environment, really bad for people living in them. And so was it evil that we had hurricanes? Well, no, because it cooled the ocean down. But it was evil because it caused destruction in my home. And so I saw it as evil. A young boy that we had in a youth group one time was out doing those kick flips on his skateboard. And as he was kick flipping, his feet got stuck in the board and he landed on his head and knocked him out. He stood up when he came to. A neighbor watched the whole thing, and he took 3 steps forward and then fell forward and hit his head again. He had brain damage. His brain was swelling. He was rushed to the children's hospital. And at that children's hospital, I sat with his mother and father, and they said, we're going to have to drill a hole in his head to allow the pressure to be relieved in his head. Well, it ended up that surgery that was supposed to be an hour, hours and hours later, they came out and said, your son is going to be lucky to survive, and if he does, he will be a vegetable. The swelling is so bad, we had to take off both sides of his skull to allow the pressure in his brain to swell. And I sat with that family after they heard this devastating news, and they said, skateboards are evil. And I sat and I pondered and thought, skateboards aren't evil, they're not good either. But the problem that they caused was seen as an evil. And so therefore it was evil. And then as I was working through the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, the 4th step invited me to look in the mirror at myself and see where there was evil inside of me. And let me tell you, if you've ever done it, it's hard to do. Because we don't want to see the evil inside of ourselves because we believe that we're good people. When you have to deal with the stuff of your lives, because every one of us have hurt someone at some time, whether purposely or unpurposely, we have hurt people. And when you look in the mirror at yourself and see yourself in its fullness, suddenly you realize that there's a part of you that needs work. In fact, what I've found in this Christian journey is that there's not an end to it. There's a beginning, but it's a continual progress towards something that looks a lot like Jesus in the world that we're never going to actually reach. And so I'm further than I was a year ago, certainly further than 10 years ago, and light years ahead of 20 years ago, but I am not there yet, and I never will be, and neither will you. Good news today, isn't it? You see, we are a work in progress, invited to look at ourselves in this process and to see the evil all around us. I'm a Christian. The story that I find myself in is wrapped up in the person of Jesus Christ. This week has been an interesting week on the blogosphere as I read lots of blogs, and this week it blew up because President Obama spoke at a prayer breakfast, and he had some hard things for us Christians to hear about our past. We're not as good as we think we are we? Our ancestors of faith haven't always been a blessing to the world. In fact, many of it has been quite horrendous. And so some bloggers blew up and said that Obama isn't a Christian and Christians are only good and we only care about God and we would only do good in this world. And in the way that he portrayed the Crusades and the witch trials and all these other things is false. Well, as one who has studied a lot of theology and a whole lot of history, I got to be honest with you, he's right on. We haven't always been as good as we like to portray ourselves to be. But we need to own that and say that we are better than that and that we're called to something higher than that. But first we have to look in the mirror and see ourselves as we actually are. And so what do we do with this phrase, it's not fair? Because heaven knows all of us have used it, and some of us are using it today. And truth be told, there are times where it's absolutely true, but there are times in which our perspective is completely wrong. A rabbi once wrote a book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People, a guy by the name of Harold Kushner. He was a rabbi in New York City and had a 3-year-old, and his wife was due with their second child. And the baby was born, and soon after, the 3-year-old passed away. He went through a crisis of faith. God, how could you allow something like this to happen to me? I'm one of your servants. Why would you let something bad happen to me, a good person? And in his book, he wrote this: is there an answer to the question of why bad things happen to good people? The response would be to forgive the world for not being perfect, to forgive God for not making a better world, to reach out to the people around us, and to go on living despite it all. No longer asking why something happened, but asking how we will respond, what we intend to do now that it has happened. Maybe part of that statement, life isn't fair, it's not fair, is wrapped up in the way that you and I respond to life. These scriptures of ours are quite inspirational, partly because some of it inspires me and part of it scares me to death. And this is one of these passages that invites me into this deep world of spiritual life in which it's not about how good of people we are, but allowing God to have space within us to create us to be the people that we're meant to be. It doesn't matter how good you are a work in progress. And so we are called to create space in our lives to allow God to be at work among us. The wise one says, when times are good, enjoy the good. And when times are bad, consider this: God has made the former as well as the latter so that people can't discover anything that will come to be after them. When times are good, he's been instructing us, rejoice, enjoy it. Enjoy the moments of goodness. But also realize that it's not forever, right? The first sermon was about the seasons. And it's not a statement of what are good seasons or bad seasons. It's just the reality of living life. Good comes and so does bad. Secondly, he says, I've seen everything in my pointless lifetime. He's hopeful, isn't he? The righteous person may die in spite of their righteousness, and then again, the wicked may live long in spite of their wickedness. It doesn't matter how good or bad you are, life is life. And what you deem as good is your good, and what you deem as bad is your bad. In seminary, our joke was that when we're going to get to heaven, we're going to be pointing around at people saying, how'd you get in? And quite honestly, if I was judge and jury, there's a few people that I might exclude from heaven. But that's not my job. My job is to be a light of hope and love and grace. When I get to heaven, I'm going to look around and say, Grandma, how did you get here? How did you get here? How did you get here? And what are they going to do to me? How did you get here? And our response is always, it wasn't me, it was God. God. So he continues, don't be too righteous or too wise, or you may be dumbfounded. Don't be too wicked or be a fool, or you may die before your time. And listen to this. It's good that you take hold of one of these without letting go of the other, because the one who fears God will go forth with both. What he's saying is that you and I hold in our hands good and bad. And for those of us that think that we're so righteous and only good, you're going to become disappointed. And I also realize in this world that some people feel like they're so bad that they can never do good, and that's not true either. You're a combination thereof. And we're invited to walk into this world with eyes wide open as to who we actually are. And truth be told, when you look in the mirror and see who you really are, you finally are free. Because you can own the good and the bad and allow God the space to reshape you. Back in the middle of the 1900s, there was a problem in our world called World War II. And there was a madman on the loose whose name was Hitler. What happened was, since the 1500s, the seedbed of theologians came out of Germany. And many had come to the United States of America to begin teaching at our seminaries. One such man's name was Reinhold Niebuhr. And Niebuhr taught and began to have a real issue with what was happening in his homeland, Germany. He knew he couldn't change it, but it was dreadful to watch. And so over time, he began trying to write a prayer, something that would help people come to an understanding of what we are powerful over and what we aren't powerful over. And so he wrote a prayer that we now call the Serenity Prayer. Have you ever heard the Serenity Prayer? The Serenity Prayer was written because he couldn't go to his homeland, but he hoped that it would inspire. The prayer originally was not conceived as an antidote for addiction, as it's used in the 12-step programs, but in response to the barbaric evil of Nazi Germany that threatened civilization during World War II. His daughter wrote a book in 2003 entitled The Serenity Prayer, and she said this: "The historical meaning of this quite modern American prayer is bound up in the war against one of the greatest evils posed during a violently evil century." The Serenity Prayer. If you don't know it, I invite you to grab the pencil in front of you and write it down. It is perhaps one of the greatest prayers penned that I use often in my life with my family, with our community of faith, with the world around us, because it resonates deeply with me. It says this: God, if you know it, you can say it with me. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And it continues: living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardships as the pathway to peace, taking as he did this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that he will make all things right if I surrender to his will, that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him forevermore in the next. Amen. You see, there's evil around us. It's not fair. And quite honestly, oftentimes we can't create the change in the world that we hope for. But what we can do is look at ourselves and say, what change needs to be done in me? As God works in you, suddenly God raises you up and allows you to soar in a way that you never dreamed possible. And maybe through that, like God did with Brother Damien, God uses you to change a community. But part of what we have to realize is that God is at work among us. And so may we have eyes to see who we really are and who God desires us to become. May God raise you up today and all the days of your life. Amen.